And so recently you have gone to. Can we talk about the dancer upstairs
Yes.
and the story behind that? I imagine it was made into a film, of course, by directed by John Malkovich. The first and only film that he's directed. I noticed. Do you think there was something
The
in the
experience of making it was so
but
difficult.
but you also wrote the script, which is a great thing for a novelist to not lose that control over the work. And so presumably you were fairly happy with the
Yes, I
the
think
outcome.
I had just taken my then girlfriend to a trek to India, spending my last penny on her, and we got back, and obviously she was going to leave me, and I had no money, and I was thinking, how am I going to get through there? The novel had come out, it had sunk after about 3 weeks, and then I get a call at 2 a.m. from my agent in New York saying, oh, John Malkovich wants to make a film of it, and I thought he was joking. He said, no, he wants to direct it. So I immediately thought, well, it's never going to get made, but at least he'll have to buy a screenwriter. So I said, well, can I do the screenplay?
Yeah.
And so I was allowed to do the screenplay, and it was enormously rewarding working with him. He had been to Peru in the very cafe which some of it is set, and he had a strong idea of what he wanted to do with the novel, which is about it's the second novel I wrote about Peru. The first, it's about a kind of Abimael Guzman was a Kantian philosopher, quite like Osama bin Laden. He was a kind of shadowy figure who led a very extreme organization called the Shining Path in the 1980s and early 90s. And they never gave interviews, and they announced their presence 30 years ago with dead dogs hanging from lampposts in Lima. And they would go into villages and cut the throats of the government representatives. And, 60,000 people died in very extreme circumstances. And I set off to do, first of all, a journalistic article for Granta about trying to find out who this man was. And no, you couldn't find out who he was. He'd vanished in 1980, and no one talked about him. So with my first novel, I invented the fact that he probably had something like psoriasis, which would account for him not appearing. And I thought, if you're the fourth sword of Marxist-Leninism, surely you'll have a kind of weakness for something American. So I made him smoke Winston cigarettes, and I gave him a passion for the songs of Frank Sinatra. I mean, this was a slightly mischievous, but I had to flesh him out somehow. And this novel came out called The Vision of Elena. And about 3 years later, the Shining Path was getting more and more advancing into Lima, and it was about to take power, really, in September 1992. And suddenly he's captured above a ballet studio in quite a smart district of Lima, of a very beautiful ballerina, middle class, educated, idealist, had a studio downstairs for young women, young girls. And upstairs there was a kind of flat within the kind of studio, but on the first floor with the curtains always drawn. And this very remarkable policeman who had been trying to follow him, like me as a novelist, he'd been the same number of years, 10 years after him, had been going through the ballerina's rubbish. And he thought that there was too much rubbish for a single girl downstairs. And sure enough, sifting the rubbish, he had found psoriasis ointment. And he had then, one night in September, to burst in to the ballet studio, and upstairs found in this first floor flat, Guzman, watching the boxing on television. And he suffered from psoriasis. And hoods were put over Guzman's head and the dancer's head, and they were taken to the police station and interrogated. And so as soon as I heard this story, I wanted to come out and write a novel about the night of the capture, because I thought I've invented the psoriasis, it's kind of happened. And so I interviewed the policeman, and I wrote this novel. And I haven't been back to Peru since. I mean, the novel came out in 1994. Anyway, in May, I was invited to interview the dancer in prison.
Something you'd never been able to.
I'd never been able to. I mean, she's never been interviewed. A person got in there and said, would she see me? And she'd written a book about dancing in prison, in confined movement. So she sent me this book saying, I'd love to talk to you. So I'm thinking, God, this is just such a wonderful opportunity because in the film she's played by a very beautiful Italian actress called Laura Moranti, and the policeman is played by Javier Bardem. Fantastic performance. And so I fly to Lima, and it's full of kind of people driving Toyotas. There's Mario Testino photographs I mean, it's become a kind of completely yuppie, affluent place. I mean, I don't think anybody's heard of the Shining Path now. So I have lunch with the lawyer when I get there, and he's the lawyer for both Guzman and the ballerina, and he's been their lawyer for 18 years. We have lunch in an empty restaurant, and he describes for me Guzman's kind of conditions in the cell and his books and his television screen. And he's going to see him and I said, is it dangerous for me to go into the women's prison on Sunday? And he said, no, I'll drive you. If you come to my house at 8 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, I'll drive you. And he was going to see Guzman and the dancer on the Friday before. And I said, well, could you ask Guzman one question on my behalf? And he said, yes. I said, what's his favorite Shakespeare play? Because before he went underground 30 years ago, he quoted apparently The Tempest, all eyes, no tongue, be silent. So I thought he'd probably read Shakespeare, so I'd be interested. And it's not a very trick question, I thought, So he said, I'll ask him that. So I spent the rest of the week in the north of the country, and I came back to Lima, and on Saturday, the headlines of the newspapers were, "The Shining Path is back." They had discovered a plot to assassinate the defense secretary, and I was thinking, oh, it's safe. I told my wife it's very safe. No. And there was now martial law in 3 of the provinces, because tomorrow was the 30th anniversary of The Shining Path, the dogs on the lamppost. And I thought, oh, no. I've been so stupid. I'm just walking into this, because all the things I'd suppressed, all the terrible stories I remembered and I hadn't forgotten, but I kind of stifled them, came just tumbling out. I mean, I remember a journalist when we lived in Lima in the 80s wanted to interview The Shining Path, who never gave interviews, and he managed to get into prison to see them, and he was released without his tongue. And there were the last time I'd been in Lima in 92, my hotel had blown up and 22 people had died in a car bomb just about 3 days after I'd left it. So I was just remembering all this stuff, but I thought, no, the lawyer's going to take me. It's okay, that's my insurance policy. So the lawyer gave me the address, 3126 Avenida Camino del Inca. So the following morning, I take a taxi and we get to Camino del Inca. We get to 3120, 3122, 3124, 3128. And he says, it doesn't exist, 3126. And I'm thinking, of course it doesn't exist. I'm going to step through this non-existent door, and I have now to go on to the prison because I've come all the way from England to see her. She knows she's waiting for me, 9 o'clock at the prison. I'm going to have to go there. And I said, go around one more time. So we went around another time, couldn't find it. And then suddenly, on the other side of 3140, we saw 3126. So I knocked on the door. The lawyer was there. I'm very pleased to see him. Breakfast is waiting. He tells me he's gone to see Guzman on the Friday, and he'd asked him my question, which was his favorite Shakespeare play. And he said, oh, Dr. Guzman he loves Shakespeare. It's his favorite author. He has it every night to read, along with Cervantes. And I said, well, they died on the same day, I think a bit morbidly. And he said, yeah, he reads it every night. And his favorite Shakespeare play is Richard III, and then Macbeth. So I thought, finally, 25 years in pursuit of this man, I've got one direct question from him. And then we drive to the prison, and the dancer is there, absolutely beautiful, 45 years old, completely, even more flaming in her beliefs.
She's been in prison for 15 years?
18 years.
18.
But she'd read the novel, and she said, that's your truth, it's not my truth. But she said, did you know, you've called the character Yolanda, did you know that my middle name is Yolanda? I said, no. And we had 6 hours in which she won't talk about whether she knew that Guzman was upstairs. She denies that she knew he was upstairs, basically, which is a strange thing to do because she's been sent to prison for the same amount of time as if she admitted he was upstairs. And I said, I'm hoping to see the policeman who arrested you tomorrow. I mean, we can't find him, but I put a call out for him. And if I see him, do you have a message? She said, yes. Tell him I know he saved my life and that I hope he knows I'm innocent. So I said, fine. I invited her to come to Tasmania when she gets out.
But there were 2 other aspects.
Yes, well, the following day I did see the policeman on the 30th anniversary of Shining Path. He came to see me, and he talked. In the novel, he stands for president, and then parlays his love of the ballerina with the fact that she'll be let out after a decent interval. Well, he told me that he's now standing for president. And I said this in the noise. He said, I know, fiction can predict these things. And then he described how Guzman, how he had arrested him, how Guzman was broken down by the security services because they took him the complete hits of Frank Sinatra. And Guzman apparently is addicted to Frank Sinatra, and he used to sing My Way in prison in Spanish. I said, no, I invented this. No, it's the truth. And I told him about seeing the ballerina. I said, she sends her regards, and she knows you saved her life. He said, yes, she would have been shot if I hadn't kind of alerted the press. And she says that she hopes you know she's innocent. And he says, no. When I was interviewing Guzman the following morning, I called for her to be brought up, and I wanted to see her reaction. And so she came upstairs, and as soon as she was in the doorway, she ran through, unable to control her emotions, and embraced Guzman and said, my president. And he said, the policeman said, it's a tragedy, she's a puppet, and it's awful, because I'm on her side too. I want what she wants, but I don't think we should do state violence or borrow their tactics.
What do you think is going on there with you, the inventions that you've created to fill in the gaps, then actually, turning out to be true?
Well, it's hugely validating to me, the fictional process. At a time when people say, what future has the novel? I think it confirms that the novel has a great future. But I also think it's not that mysterious. I think if you try and imagine yourself close to somebody, you often end up getting close to the truth. And I mean, these aren't very big coincidences. They're not kind of earth-changing, but they're kind of interestingly humanly validating, I think.
And as a writer in your brain, how do you switch between writing journalism and writing novels? Because I imagine as a novelist you just imagine stuff and put it in, but as a journalist, do you find you wanting to imagine stuff and think, oh no, must shut down that thought process and stay with what I've got, what's there?
Well, you're a journalist now. If you start inventing stuff in journalism, I think you've had it. I mean, I know people do.
That's right.
I think
but you have that whole area of your brain that is so well exercised. I guess the question is how do you shut it down? How do you say, no, this is the side of my brain that I'm working with today. That's the space that I'm in. You wrote a fantastic piece about the artist Ian Fairweather, which was journalism, which was published in the Australian's Literary Review a month or so ago. So that's quite a different approach. Or did you employ license?
I don't think they're too different. I mean, I after writing a novel, and this is quite a common tradition in England. I mean, there are people like Peter Ackroyd and A.N. Wilson and Victoria Glendinning who and Colin Thubron, who go from fiction to non-fiction. And it's quite a relief when you've done a novel. It's exhausting, this imaginative effort. It's 3 years' work, and I mean, a novel is an exercise in failure anyway, so you kind of know it's going to not be as good as it should be, and you just hope it's going to be.
What do you mean by an exercise in failure?
Because like a film, I mean, you put all your effort into it, but there are only about 5 or 6 great films. And there are only 5 or 6 great novels, and it's almost an impossible thing to write a good novel. But that doesn't stop you trying.
What is your favourite novel? You said before you asked Graham Greene what was
of my own.
Yours.
It's slightly like asking you which is your favourite child, because
that's my next question.
It's like it's hard. I mean, you tend to protect the ones that people haven't liked, and so I would say. The High Flyer, which is my second novel, which none of you have heard about, which is set in a diplomat who disgraced himself and goes to Ceuta in North Africa. And I like Secrets of the Sea also, which it's become a bestseller in Germany, but in England, I mean, people haven't really read about it. So, but I think you put your best thing into all your novels. So you recognize their faults, but you recognize the faults of your children. And you've put your best into them, so you can't kind of dump on them too much. You probably don't have any focus either.
Do we have any questions? Does anybody have anything they want to put to Nicholas? Do we have a spare microphone, or was this the travelling microphone? I imagine. Your question?
I just finished reading Secrets of the Sea, and I had to ask, someone who's had a child who played a huntsman?
The question was, this lady's just finished reading Secrets of the Sea and was asking if you know somebody whose child has eaten a huntsman.
Not only do I know, I watched the huntsman being eaten. It was in the daycare, the local daycare called Little Friends, and I had dropped off the Friends, and it was Little Fiends. He was called Zach, and he ate the huntsman, and his mother suddenly saw and kind of ripped it out, but he kept chewing it. And the doctor, she took him to the doctor, and the doctor said, no, he'll just fart for a bit, which is what he did. And it didn't affect him. No, most of the details like that, I tell you, are local and true. I couldn't tell the entire truth of what a local Tasmanian village is like, because I probably would have my house burnt down. But the huntsman, I felt, was kind of marginally okay.
Any other questions? Yes?
What difference did you find writing a screenplay to writing a book, and which did you enjoy the most?
So the question was, what was the difference between writing a screenplay and writing a book, and which did you enjoy the most? And in fact, there was another screenplay that you have been working on, which I haven't yet seen made into a film, on Indigenous Tasmanians.
I mean, I think the difference between a book and a screenplay is the difference between a donkey and a carrot. I mean, they're such different creatures, even though they have the illusion of being similar. I really enjoyed writing the screenplay because Malkovich was kind of there, so it was a collaborative thing, and so the blame and the success could be shared, and it wasn't so lonely. It was very difficult. I mean, it went through about 6 or 7 versions, but a novel does that too. But in the end, I think Malkovich thinks he probably wrote it. So I have no control over the screenplay now. But not that I mind. But I think if a screenplay is made, it then is great fun. But I think very few screenplays are made into films. And so I've done 2 subsequent screenplays. One for Kevin, who did the Last King of Scotland and Touching the Void. And it probably won't get made because he's gone on to other things. I mean, and you spend 6 months of your life and it's not going to see the light of day. So that's a bit dispiriting.
What made you think you could, given the difference? What made you think, was it just
I
emboldened by
didn't think I could at all. I just needed the money. I
and
spent
who
a crash
says
course.
Yes to that?
Malkovich, I think, crazily.
Yeah.
I spent a crash course going to lots of films, and they are sitting alone in lonely cinemas in Nottingham Gate watching, or whatever.
Well, that's what I thought. Did you get a script of a film that you like and basically say, there's the template?
I went to see it. One man I know who'd written a film, Richard Curtis, who'd written 4 Weddings and a Funeral. I went to see him, and I said, look, mine's about Peruvian terrorism. I know 4 Weddings and a Funeral is slightly different, but is there anything I can learn? He said, yes. He gave me 2 pieces of advice. Don't make any scene longer than 3 pages. And remember that every line you write is going to be watched on set by 100 bored technicians who have something much better to do. So the lines better be good. And that was quite helpful. I mean, I'd made lots of documentaries, which isn't quite the same thing. But I understood a tiny bit about putting together visual sequences. But I'd say, I went down and met Malkovich with my first draft, and he went through it, and we talked about his calamitous first marriage, and I brought some details from that into the screenplay, and turned out we'd shared a girlfriend once, not at the same time, but I mean, we brought her into the screenplay, and so I loved all that process, and I lived with him for on and off about 6 months with his family, and so it was nice. It was a complete change from writing a novel, having to live with your own family.
A question at the back? Oh.
I have no say. What
the question was about the cover of a book, how significant it is, and why there are British birds on the cover of In Tasmania.
There is first of all, my idea was that somebody who's in a book design of a publishing house, I would imagine that you would want to read the books, but they don't. So, for instance, with Secrets of the Sea, I mean, the other thing is that there's a perception that it's only women who buy novels, which may be true, but why would then a woman want, and they always put women on the cover, so why would a woman want to buy a woman on the cover? I mean, sure, you put a man on the cover.
Right.
So
the
whole thing is, so with, for instance, Inheritance, I had this idea, arty idea for a cover. I thought, well, because it begins in the desert, you'd have a man in the red sand Pilbara, you know, and you'd have his shadow stretching ahead of him, and the shadow would end up, it would go thin, and then it would end up in the shape of a woman. So he's kind of, his own shadow is going towards a woman. I thought this was terrific. You know, yeah. They didn't want to hear. And so what happens? A rainy February afternoon with a woman. And I said, well, could you make her look a little? So we had to chop her. She was very kind of prominent-chinned in the first draft. So the only influence I had was to make her less strong-chinned. That's the power a writer has over his cover.
Can I ask about Joseph Silke, who's apparently a wetsuited character who has appeared in most of your novels? Did I miss him in Inheritance, or have you?
He's on the last page.
I felt robbed.
He's in Melbourne, I think. He's in a high-security prison in Melbourne. No, I have a character called Joseph Silke, who's a kind of appalling creature who appears in all the novels. He's a kind of deus ex aqua. He sometimes appears from the sea, and he's trying to write his autobiography. And he knows he'll be able to do it once he gets the title right. So he spends his life saying, I've got the title, it's going to be called, and then he goes to sleep thinking he's got it, and tomorrow he can begin work on his autobiography. And he wakes up and he realizes it's a really crap title. So he has to go on. Anyway, he appears like a leitmotif. And one day I might write his autobiography. At the moment, I think I might call it Without a Paddle.
What, are you working on a book at the moment?
I... through a very strange and kind of hair-raising coincidence, I was in the Bodleian Library finishing Chatwin's letters a few months ago, and I came across an archive that referred to my aunt, who'd been an English woman who was married to a French viscount in occupied France, and she spent the entire occupation in France. I mean, my sister and my grandfather never heard what she was up to. And I used to go down to see her. She left the Viscount after the war, and she married a mushroom farmer in West Wittering, and I used to go down to see her there. And she had the first television set I'd ever seen, and she was upstairs in her room, and I used to watch, you know, telly on her bed. And she died about 20 years ago, and in the box on which the television set was discovered lots of love letters and photographs. And last year I went down to see her stepdaughter, who had found this box, and she said, yes, you can have it. And the first photograph I look at is of my aunt naked. She was a very beautiful kind of Lauren Bacall lookalike. She's naked on a hayloft, languorously having had sex or about to have sex or thinking of sex. And it's in the middle of occupied France. It's 1941. And then there are these photographs of handsome Frenchmen, you know, with goggles and conger eels, or she's on a ski slope in a fur coat, and I'm thinking, what the hell's going on here? Because we'd been led to believe she was in a concentration camp for and indeed she also had been in a concentration camp, and she'd written about this, and so I went, you know, no one knew, and she'd never talked about the war, but so that there's this crate of 5 or 6 lovers, one of whom was called Otto. And anyway, I didn't know what I was going to do. I thought I'd have to do fiction because I didn't know what the story was. I knew I wanted to write about it, but I couldn't see where the story led. And then in the Bodleian Library, I come across this archive of her best friend who'd grown up in Paris with her and who had met her after the war. And I take it out and I read my name. This woman says, now I've seen what Nicholas Shakespeare has written about his aunt, I'm going to tell the truth about what she got up to in occupied France. And I'd written an article 20 years ago in which I'd mentioned my aunt had been in a concentration camp in France. That's all I said. And apparently she hadn't been. She'd been in an internment camp. But anyway, that was enough to spark her best friend to now write down what exactly my aunt got up to. And she had questioned her about these lovers, and she had got all the information about the lovers, and she'd questioned her about Otto in particular. And my aunt said, oh, no, he was Swiss, and went on and on questioning, no, Swiss-German, and said no more. And anyway, after my article turned out, this woman called Gillian Sutro started to dig around about Otto and found that Otto had been head of the German Abwehr in Paris, in charge of all the confiscated art being sent back to Goering and Hitler. And so I have love letters from Otto to my aunt, and I rang my mother that night and said, I think your sister was having an affair with a prominent Nazi. And she said, oh, I wouldn't be surprised, you know, the war. Sorry, that's what I'm writing about next.
Look, do you have a title yet?
It's going to just be called Priscilla, which was her name.
Well, thank you so much, Nicholas, for sharing all of that with us. It's been terrific.